Hi, everyone. In this section, we examine who we are as Americans. And specifically, we're looking at how we define race and how we define class, as in social class, um, monetary, education backgrounds. So, unless you are indigenous, and there may be some of you who are indigenous, meaning that you were native to this land in America, you were a Native American, what we used to call Native Indians, but no longer use that term. You are either an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants. So this land, was not European in nature, and now it is predominated by people from all over the world, which the Statue of Liberty on the slide is, representation of. So there's lots of different ways to talk about the term diversity. People throw it around a lot, right? They like to talk about diversity. But what does it truly mean to be diverse? And sometimes we have a depiction of what diversity means, but diversity can mean lots of things. So we can have a demographic diversity, such as the type of foods that we can purchase in different communities and different areas. And if any of you know a good Asian market to buy like Asian goods, please let me know. I had one when I lived in Westchester. I'm no longer here. So demographic diversity refers to the people's needs in a particular community, and what is available to people in that community. We can also have socioeconomic diversity, meaning diversity in terms of the economic levels of individuals, how much money they have, how much they're able to afford, what type of living conditions they live in. So if you look closely at this picture, you can see this is an abandoned house. This is actually my house. So I purchased this abandoned house in, oh, what year was it? 2021 or maybe 2022? 2022, my husband and I, and we have since renovated it. But if you see homes like this in a neighborhood, right, in an area, you know you are in an area that is economically diverse. So you have people who are losing their homes because they cannot afford to keep them, which you may not see in another area. You may never see an abandoned house in certain areas, whereas you will see them in some. Um, so when we study demography, we are studying demographics, and demographics refer to characteristics of people that help define the people. It can refer to age, it can refer to sex, it can refer to how much money a person makes, it can refer to their religion. All of these things are part of individuals' demographics, and all of these things are part of um, diversity. So we often use the census, the United States Census, in order to understand where we are in terms of diversity. So, who are our people in America? Who are we? From what backgrounds do we come? I said it when we started this section that we are all immigrants or descendant of immigrants, but from where, right? What are the predominant countries that our people come from in America? So we use the United States Census to record that. And the very first census ever done in our country was done in 1790. And it's done every 10 years, excuse me, every 10 years. And the last census we had was from 2020. And a lot of the data that we are going to be using in this class, when we discuss trends and things that are going on in healthcare and diversity, um, we'll be using information from that last census in 2020. So a census allows us to understand our population. It allows us to understand who our people are and what they need. Um, we can see communities that are impoverished and need help. We can see communities that need assistance by looking at the census. We can understand where people are working and where people are not working, where there needs to be more jobs. So the census provides us with detailed information about individuals and their lives. People can often be reluctant to fill out a census Censuses are never used to report anyone to authority figures. They're never used to tell on anyone. Census, and I understand people's reluctance, right? I understand, let's say a person is receiving some kind of monetary support from the government, but is also working a small part-time job that is off the books. And they're afraid to put that down because they're afraid it's going to go into the wrong hands and they're going to get in trouble. Um, that it's not something the census is interested in. They're not reporting any of this data to anyone. They are using this data only to categorize people and to understand where we are with regard to, let's say, poverty levels, or where we are with regard to ethnicity and breakdowns, and how many children are people having, and how many children are there in a certain community versus another one. But I totally understand people's reluctance, but my mother worked for the census. My brother worked for the census. The census hires part-time people whenever it needs. And I can tell you firsthand that the census does not tell on anyone. It does not rat on anyone. The data is only used for demography in order to say who are our Americans, where are they, how much money are they making, what are their races, etc. So what about their races, right? What is their races, right? Race is a really, really complicated term. And I didn't always understand for myself in my lifetime what race meant. I thought I knew, but I actually didn't know. Um, when we ask people to identify their race, we usually let them pick what they want to say. But the government will often find categories to put people into, and ask you to check a category to define which race you belong to. But what's interesting about these categories is that these categories are socially created. And so we call them social constructs. They were not categories that existed in nature. They are not something that were pre existing, they were created. Race was not always something that we even tabulated or worried about. If we look at ancient societies did not divide people according to different physical characteristics, because that's what race is. We're dividing people according to physical characteristics. Um, we have divided people according to statuses in society, right? We have had, people who are um, serfs, right? If we look back at feudalism, or slavery, if we look back at slavery, slavery was also dividing people, of course, by race. But we have had systems that people of the same race were dividing into castes, right? CASTE, a caste saying that this group was the upper class, this was the royalty, these were the peasants, that kind of thing. But it wasn't until um, really the 1500s that we actually started to use a word to describe dividing people according to how they look, not according to which caste or category we felt they belonged in, because of their socioeconomic background. So, how do you divide people then? What kind of characteristics do you use in order to put a person into a category? And what we've often used in our country is skin color, hair texture, and the shape of nose. That's what we've used. So here's a scale that defines or shows you different levels of skin color, from the palest to the darkest hand. Shape of nose. This is actually from an old text showing differences in types of noses that might belong to different groups of people at in different parts of the world. We know texture of hair can be used to define race as well. I don't have a slide on that. I should. Um, but that is another characteristic that can be used to define people. But the question has always been, do genes define people? Do genes define race? And you would think, yeah, right? You would think that if you get a white person and a black person and you put them together in a room and you take their genealogy, you take their DNA, right? And you compared it, it would be really, really different. But in actuality, they're not. Okay, so the genes between a white person and a Black person are not very different. Um, we've known this for a long time. We've known for a long time that our genes don't differ that much. We have a lot of differences between genes. So let's say two white people, right? Two white people have a lot of differences between their genes, but not any, but Black and a white person don't have more differences between their genes. So I hope that makes sense to you. So we all share some genes in common and we all have some differences. And race isn't making those differences bigger. The amount of differences we have between us tends to be the same, whether we are from the same race or from a different race. So our genes don't really reflect that much difference if we are from different races. And we've known this for a long time. Therefore, we say that race is socially constructed. That means society made it up and used arbitrary characteristics to define what makes a race, right? So they used hair texture. If you know me, if you've seen me, you see I have very curly hair. And it was actually curlier when I was younger. It's actually loosened up somewhat. My mother had the same hair. If you had used it, but I am clearly white, right? But if you use that as a way to define race, you could argue that I am not white. We even had a term that was once considered a racial term because the terms that we use to describe race are constantly changing, right? So if you look, the next time you read a form and you have to fill out your race, see what terms are on there that you're being asked to say if you are that race or not. See which terms are on there. The terms are constantly changing. So it could be, Black, white, Hispanic, excuse me, it could be um, Asian, Native American. And one of the terms that used to be used is mulatto. And mulatto, I'm sorry. I have to pause a minute. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I had to cough. Mulatto was once considered a racial term, and it is now considered an offensive word. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term mulatto, but it used to be used to describe a person who was mixed race, Black and white. That's what the term mulatto was used. And if the person was a woman, they would say mulatta. Um, the reason it's considered offensive is because of this animal, a mule. So the word mulatto came from a mule, and a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. Um, so to be a mix of black and white was viewed similarly to being an animal that can be used for work reasons, um, labor reasons. So it's not a term we use anymore, but it was once considered to be a term to describe race. So as I was saying, we are more similar than different when we compare DNA of people of different races. So there tends to be more within group differences than between group differences. So let me show you what that means. So here's two pots of flowers. Within each pot, we see that each flower is different sizes. So let's look at the pot that says poor soil, right? Those flowers are all different sizes. Some are really tall, some are really small. There's variability within that group. If we look at the fertile soil pot, there's also variability within that group, where some are really tall, some are really small. That is within group variation. Between group variation would be, let's compare the poor soil to the fertile soil. So we have more within group variability than we have between group variability when we look at people of different races. Um, If we look at people of the same race, right? So if you look at all white people have a lot of genetic variation. That's within group variation. There's lots of differences between us. There aren't more differences if we compare white people to Black people. It's the same within group variability. So as humans, we share between 94 to 99% of our DNA, regardless of race. And 1 to 6% of our DNA is different. So whether it be within or between. So the whole argument that we should be divided racially is not a good point. It's not scientifically sound. We don't have that many differences. The differences that we are dividing us based on is physical, right? It's just physical characteristics. Now, there can be genetic differences between people. For instance, people from certain parts of the world might have a predisposition towards certain illnesses, right? So Ashkenazi Jew, which are people who are of Jewish ancestry from certain countries in Europe. I think Russia being one of them. I should know this, but I don't. But Ashkenazi Jew is a particular types of Jewish ancestry. They often they have a higher likelihood of having the BRCA gene if you're from a background of being Ashkenazi Jew. That is a difference, right? That can be associated with what we might consider race, but that's not really race. So if you are Ashkenazi Jew, that's not your race. It's what part of the world you derive from. That's your ancestry. And that is more ethnicity, right? So ethnicity doesn't really refer to race, it refers to what country you come from. If you are someone who was born in Portugal, you may be white or you may be Black. If you are someone who's born in the Dominican Republic, you may look white or you may look Black. Your ethnicity still would be Dominican. Your ethnicity would still be Portuguese because you came from that particular part of the world. So ethnicity is nationality, it's country of origin. It often refers to the language that the person grew up hearing or speaking. It can refer to the type of foods and customs that the person enjoys. So let's go back to this whole race idea. If you were completing paperwork for race, one of these categories would probably be a category you were asked to check off. Sometimes you're asked to select just one, but sometimes you can check any categories that apply. So right now, the categories that we use are white, Black, sometimes they'll say Black or African American, but not everyone who's Black is African American, Asian, American Indian or Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. But these categories that you see, these weren't always the categories. So if we go back to my childhood, the categories were different. So these were not always the categories. This on top. So in the 1700s, when we started dividing races up in the United States, there were 3 groups. We had white, which were Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. And not all, very interestingly, not all white Europeans were allowed to be allowed in quotes white, right? So certain people, when they came from Europe, they were not deemed white, even though they were European. And sometimes they would be placed in the African category because that's how they were seen by society. So again, race was used to divide people based on physical characteristics that were either liked or not liked. If we look at 1930, Mexican was a racial category. That's not a racial category, but it was because that's what we were considering it a Mexican category. We were considering Mexican. You couldn't say you were white. What that meant is Mexicans weren't allowed to click a white button, right? They weren't allowed to say they were white. Given that the white society at the time had the benefits, right? It had the wealth, it had the access. Many individuals who were coming here and not being allowed to click this white category really wanted that white category and tried to do whatever they could to be accepted into this white community. So when I was a child, I wasn't 1930 when I was a child, but when I was a child, it was 19 in the 1970s. Hispanic was a category for race, not for ethnicity, for race. So you again weren't white, right? You were Hispanic, and that's what you had to check. You couldn't check off that you were white. You checked off that you were Hispanic. They removed it by the time the 2000 census came along. So we're constantly revising racial categories, looking at, what could we add, what could we take away. But as you see, these are created, they're constructed by society. So let's watch this short video about race.
Have you ever wondered why people say, oh, I don't see color as a way to fix racism? Yeah, that doesn't work. On this show, we talk about race all the time, but I've got a bomb to drop. Biologically speaking, race doesn't exist. Oh my goodness, we've all been lied to! Wait, why am I hosting this show? So race isn't biological, but the social construct of race and racism still have a very real impact on everyone's lives. And this isn't just about feelings. Race is all about the structural foundation of social power. So why do so many people incorrectly think race is biological? Well, beyond the fact that we like to group people based on external characteristics, it goes like this. In biology, there is a concept of genetically different subspecies, which a lot of people confuse with human races. Biologists actually have a scale for this, and humans don't even come close to qualifying. Throughout history, people have used this incorrect understanding of subspecies to justify all kinds of terribleness, and even proclaim other races as less than human. But modern genetics has shown that the lines around race are so arbitrary that they're actually meaningless. And since I'm not a scientist, I'll take a quote. Francis Collins, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said it himself: those who wish to draw precise racial boundaries around certain groups will not be able to use science as a legitimate justification. Oops, I dropped the mic. So if race doesn't exist biologically, why do we keep talking about it? Sound the alarm! We keep talking about race because we created it. Yay, us! That's right, race is a social construct. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society and then applied to individuals or groups. But social constructs are still very real and have huge impacts on our lives. Because you know what else is a social construct? Money. And if you don't think money has an enormous impact on your life, well then congratulations. You either have a trust fund or you're an adorable baby. Or maybe you're a dog. Here's what I know. Talking about racism just creates more racism. No. First off, race isn't the problem. Racism is. And even if it was the problem, problems don't get worse when you talk about them, and they don't magically go away when you ignore them. Not true. I had 5 cavities, I ignored them, and all 5 of those teeth fell out. Poof. Problem solved. Colorblindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism. Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others. Ignoring it just lets those problems persist. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at some examples where colorblindness doesn't work. Number 1, preschool punishment. Let's face a fact. Preschool-aged children of every race are monsters. But according to the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights report released in 2014, Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, but almost half of all suspensions. Half. And I don't think anybody believes all these preschool teachers are racist out to get little Black children, but the data shows that Black and Latino children often face steeper punishments than their white classmates for the same behavior. That's a problem. And simply believing we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't talk about race does nothing to solve this problem. Number 2, the name study. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research confirmed that people with ethnic sounding names, that's a whole nother episode, are less likely to get interviewed when they apply for jobs. Meanwhile, applicants with white sounding names actually get 33% more callbacks for interviews. It's the equivalent of having 8 years of additional experience. Shout out to all the white Taquans struggling to get job interviews. And it's not just Black and white. They've done similar studies around the world, and in Canada, people with white sounding names were 35% more likely to get callbacks than people with Indian or Chinese sounding names. So instead of just assuming people shouldn't care about color or names, companies, governments, and schools should take the bias out of hiring and experiment with nameless resumes to, solve the problem. Number 3, renting an apartment. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Urban Institute did a study about real estate, they found that Black, Latino, and Asian renters were shown up to 12% fewer units than white renters. And when the Fair Housing Justice Center used actors to apply for apartments, they found that Black and Latino renters were often told there were no apartments available, while white applicants were shown apartments in the same building. So this building has a pool, a laundry room, and a racist landlady. Colorblindness won't fix housing discrimination. We're going to need smart laws and a concerted effort for that. So tell me again how colorblindness is going to fix the fact that I can't get an education, a job, or a house. In many cases, colorblindness is actively harmful because it creates a false sense of security for the groups it directly benefits. The people who've benefited from systemic racism can assume that they got the job or a house or weren't suspended from preschool simply because they were more qualified or just better. Ignoring race or only acknowledging that it doesn't exist biologically is not a solution to these systemic issues. It takes work, effort, laws, and new systems to undo racism. These differences may seem minute, but they're part of a very large structure of oppression that's been ingrained in us. If we can understand that we made it up, we can actively work to change it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
Okay, so the US Census now uses these categories of race. And who's to say if these will be the categories that we stay with, but this is what we're using now. And these categories are defined. So we tend to talk about white as being individuals who come from Europe, but also the Middle East and North Africa, which is interesting, right? Because if you are from, let's say, Egypt, you can be qualified as white differently than if you perhaps came from the Congo or from another Sudan, another African country. Black and African American, these can include individuals who identify as Black but may not identify with coming from Africa, especially individuals who might be indigenous to many of the islands in the United States or in other areas of the world. American Indian and Alaskan Native. Um, this includes some areas of Central America, and then Asian. It has a wide range of individuals that have origins from Asia, and this includes people who come from India, which many people, when they use the term Asian, don't think of. And then Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander is also another category we currently use. And then we have some other race. It allows for other responses or for people who may identify as mixed race. So Hispanic is now not considered a race on the census. Instead, Hispanic individuals will be asked to categorize themselves according to what race they believe they belong to. There's some kind of sentence on there that'll say something along the lines of Hispanics can derive from many racial groups. Which racial group do you derive from? And many individuals will wind up putting down the white category, even if that is not something they feel especially attached to. Hispanic, just like Asian, encompasses lots of different people from lots of different countries. Basically, using the language of Spanish as the identifying factor. And many individuals will argue that people who identify as Hispanic, there's major differences, right? If you are from Spain or if you are from Puerto Rico, even your language will sound different. Your Spanish will sound different. The way you live will be different. The foods you eat will be different. So many argue this really shouldn't be a category, right? Because there's more differences between, there's more differences within Hispanic group than there would be between, let's say, Hispanic and another group. But nonetheless, this is how we are categorizing people. So for the 2020 census, the most common racial group was white at a little over 50%, 57.8, followed by Hispanic at 18.7, and Black or African American non-Hispanic at 12. But this was a major change. So the 2020 census found that the Hispanic group was growing significantly faster than any other group, and that the white group was slowing and declining significantly faster than any other group. So if we look at the 2010 census, white was 72%, right? So that was a larger majority than 57.8%, right? We dropped as whites, we dropped, whereas as Hispanics, we increased. So in 2010, 16% of the population was Hispanic, whereas in 2020, 18.7, almost 20% of the population was Hispanic. So this has been a trend that we have been seeing, that the Hispanic population is growing while the white population is declining. The white population is also the oldest population. So the median age, not the mean, but the median is 41. The multiracial population has the youngest median age. So what we find is that the population is becoming extremely diverse and more diverse over time with more young people, whereas with the young people are amongst the other racial groups other than white. And the white is an increasingly aging racial group. So the white individuals of America aren't having as many children as other groups are. Therefore, their age group is older than other groups' age groups. So as you can imagine, this has a profound effect upon healthcare, right? Who are these individuals? Who are we caring for? As the population becomes more diverse, as less people are in the white category and more people are in the Hispanic category, encompassing many, many countries that get lumped into the Hispanic category, what kind of services do these individuals need? And we also have the white population who are aging and represent older Americans. What kind of services do they need? Right? So we have different healthcare needs. So the census tells us what we need to prepare for. Do we need to have doctors who can speak Spanish? Yes, definitely, right? Because we have a growing population that is Hispanic, and they are the younger individuals with children going to doctors, young people. And we have a elderly white population, less young people, but older individuals who might need aging type of health services. Let me move this. So this graphic shows you the breakdown of population. So if we look at the total US population on the left side, we'll look at 2019, which is the most recent. The black bar represents the number of white people in society, or the percentage of white people in society. And the red bar represents the number of Hispanic people in society. And you can see how much fatter, wider the red bar has become and the white bar has shrunken. And then if we look at young people under the age of 16 on the right side, the three bars on the right side, we see that in 2019, young people were mostly represented by Hispanic. That group again grew with 25.8% of young people being Hispanic, needing immunizations, needing healthcare needs such as sicknesses, childhood sicknesses, and injuries, let's say, from sporting events, and less individuals being white, that black piece of the bar, um, who are at the younger population under the age of 16. Another graphic, where are people being born the most? Where do we see the most growth in the population in the United States? And we see the most growth in the population among Hispanic individuals, followed by Asian, followed by Black, followed by two races, followed by Native American, with the least amount of white contribution to the population of society. So if we look at that, if we translate this into population totals, Hispanics or Latinos are 10 million people, more than half of the nation's 2010 to 2019 growth. That is extremely significant. And if that rate continues, if we continue at this rate, right, going forward, Hispanic will eventually overcome white being the dominant race, right? If we keep those racial groups, Hispanic will be the largest group. Again, another graphic showing you percentages of individuals in the American population and how that has changed over time. Um, this looks at the median age, how we are getting older. So the median age of everyone together of the census was 37. Now it's almost 39 in 2020. If we look at people between the ages of 18 and 64, that was 62% of the population in 2010, and now it's 79% of the population. So we are getting older. Um, Again, another slide that talks about how we're getting older. The 65 and older population was 13% of the population in 2010, and in 2020 is 16.8% of the population. So significantly more people getting older. Different needs are in society, right? So you have particular needs. If you have a primary care doctor who's doing immunizations and, healthcare such as flu and COVID, wellness checks, and things like that, you would need a doctor who is able to handle diversity of their clients and their participants. Whereas with individuals who are older, you may not have those same needs for that doctor. Okay, I'm going to stop this now and do a second bunch of slides, a second audio video so it doesn't go that long for the next group.